The history nerds are back. Yes, my name is Brad Pomerance. I am joined by two of my favorite people in the whole world because I am the king of the history nerds and they're my, well, maybe I'm in your court. I'm not sure whose court's and who. But
we're in her court.
Yeah, we're in your court. Well, who we're talking about is Bob Dutton, of course. Bob Dutton is the Assessor-Clerk-Recorder in San Bernardino County. You know him well. He had been GOP Senate leader in the California State Senate. He is joined by Genevieve Preston. She is the Archivist for San Bernardino County. And before we talk about another tale coming out of San Bernardino County, I want to get a sense from you, Mr. Dutton. How is it that the Assessor-Clerk-Recorder is involved in the archives of San Bernardino County?
Well, it was a restructuring that took place, and frankly, the Assessor-Recorder always was involved in preserving documents, historical documents, because we are the custodian for all recorded documents of the county and records of ownership and so forth. So there was kind of a natural connection between the Assessor-Recorder and archives. So when I was elected the Assessor-Recorder, to my surprise, I didn't know at the time. I was given this treasure called Archives, and of course I met Genevieve, and like you, I'm kind of interested in the history of things, and so it's been a real enjoyable responsibility that I've been given.
And I want to say thank you for that, because I think it's very easy for archives to be neglected.
Oh, absolutely.
And what we know is so much of our present is informed by our past. And you both invited me to the archives, and I thank you for that. I was there recently, and just even being around the archives, you have that sense of history, and you have been able to provide us with some stories that we would never know, with some players that are so critical to the development of various regions in San Bernardino County. Sir, why did you, other than the fact that we're kind of history nerds, why did you decide to make this a priority?
Well, because I think it's important. My experience, both professionally as an elected official in the Senate and other things, is that I think it's really important for people to understand the historical relevance to why things happen. And so with archives, we can do that. We can go back to the early beginnings of San Bernardino County and kind of figure out, you know, what was the thinking back then? What happened to create this situation? And because I think it's important for us as we move forward to respect that and to also be understanding as to what the thinking process was so we can better plan for the present as well as for the future.
So let's talk about another tale that Genevieve Preston has uncovered in your archives. And this focuses upon a city in San Bernardino County known as 29 Palms. Beautiful, majestic, known for its military installation, as well as the Joshua Tree National Park. But let's go back. And let's talk about the formation of what's known as 29 Palms. And I am holding up a picture of what's known as the Oasis of Marah. Did I say that right?
Marah.
Marah. Tell us about what this picture depicts, because it talks to us.
So the first people who supposedly settled in the area were the Serrano Indians, and they were told to settle there by a medicine man who told them they would have many boys if they lived there.
Boys, of course, because that's all that we want. God forbid we should have daughters, but it's boys that we want, at least back then.
And so they were told every time a boy was born, they should plant a palm. So in the first year, they planted 29 palms.
Mr. Dutton, I guess that's how we got the name of the city, 29. I never knew.
So that's supposedly the myth of how the city got its name.
Is it a myth or is it a fact?
Well, there are a lot of palms out there.
Right. So, okay. So 29 Palms quickly becomes...
It's pretty much a wintering ground for the cattle in the area, because there were a lot of cattle in our local area. And so they wintered down there because it's cool, but there's still vegetation for them to eat. And so a lot of people use the cattle, and we found a great cattle brand. I had to pick that one because it is Bob.
Bob.
Yes.
Bob. Your name's Bob Dutton.
Yeah. And it was pretty hard to tally or change. And what actually happened in the area was, because it is a very remote desert location, some people did use it for some nefarious activities. And the McCaney gang comes into using the springs, not the Oasis actually, but another spring in the area, the Hidden Valley Spring.
And this, by the way, is the McCaney Ranch.
That is their ranch, and that is where they supposedly, it was never proven, tallied cattle from Mexico and Arizona that was brought, so their cattle brands were changed.
And what does tally mean?
It means you literally change the cattle brand to your brand. And so oftentimes that would happen. So if your brand was an S, maybe their brand was an SS, so that they would add an extra S.
And the reason why you have these records is because...
They're recorder records.
Right.
right. Like what she said. What she said. So let us continue.
Yeah.
Because the McCaneys really quite colorful characters. So we know they're committing nefarious acts with regard to cattle. Then we get involved in mining.
Yes, so a lot of miners start coming to the area because they think, well, there's mining up in the upper part of the desert, why not the same area lower? So a lot of miners start coming into the area in the 1880s, and the McCaneys decide they're going to no longer be in the cattle business, they want to go into the mining industry.
And give us a sense as to why your office has these mining records.
Well, one of the responsibilities for the assessor's office is to keep track of all ownership of property, both real and personal. So in this case here, mining interests, mining claims involving real estate and so forth, but also cattle. As you talked before, we would actually put a value on the cattle, and that was the basis for which they were being taxed. So we have all those records.
Right.
And then a lot of the times, in order to protect your rights, you are going to record various documents. And so the assessor recorder is a nice combination,
Right.
along with archives, because that is where the records start, and archives is how we can preserve records of historical significance.
But the illicit affairs of the
The
McCaneys does not end with cattle. It continues with mining.
Yes, so apparently a local miner named Frank James went to the springs where they did their illicit cattle tallying, and told them he'd found a good claim of gold, which was
Critical.
not smart.
And we've talked about mining on this show together. The silver rush in the area, gold apparently is also found.
Yes.
And so Mr. James tells the McCaneys, guess what? I found some gold, so what do?
He gets shot and killed. And the only official record as to what happened is actually the coroner's inquest.
Which is what you have in the archives. You have
We
the coroner's
do.
inquest.
And most coroner's inquests at this time are about a page long. This one's about 30 pages with exact detail as to what happened, because one of the McCaney gang, Charlie Martin, apparently shot Frank James, but it was self-defense, and it gets ruled self-defense, even though another member of the gang accidentally left his gun beside a tree, and Martin just happened to pick up his gun and just happened to shoot James. But James was coming at him with a knife, even though Martin had no wounds by the time the coroner or sheriff got there. They did have a shirt with rips in it that showed that he had been.
And what's stunning about what you're describing is that you can describe it. This is a crime that took place in, 1894, I think
Yes.
it was? And the fact that we have all these records.
It's the court records, court documentations, death certificates, things like this are all filed with the county recorder's office.
So when we come back, I want to continue and learn more about what happened with the Martins, the McCaneys, this criminal event, and it really does continue to inform what the development of the 29 Palms and the whole Morongo Basin, how it developed. We're speaking with Bob Dutton and Genevieve Preston. I'm Brad Pomerance. Stick around. We'll be right back. We are in the middle of a murder mystery that took place in 1894, and we are able to track the intricacies of the murder mystery because of the archives kept in San Bernardino County by the Assessor-Clerk-Recorder Bob Dutton, his archivist Genevieve Preston. And so we know that Frank James had been murdered. He had owned or had found gold and was making a claim for this gold.
He had found gold. He put up the monuments or the rocks to lay where his claim was, and he had his paperwork. But he gets shot and killed by one of the McKinney gang, Charlie Martin, but who's conveniently his paperwork, when the sheriff coroner came out to investigate the crime, Martin's paperwork was dated 2 days before.
Of course
Frank
it was.
James.
And then, now what happened to, so Martin was acquitted.
He was acquitted, that it was self-defense, that he shot Frank James in self-defense. Of course, the only people giving evidence were Martin Myers, whose gun was used,
Right.
and the McKinneys, who were in the area.
But then we have someone named Charlie Marshall enter the scene.
Correct.
And who is Charles Marshall?
Charles Marshall was the first person to lay a claim to the area, who then gave it to Frank James. But he conveniently left the area and went down to San Jacinto.
And what did he do there?
He murdered 2 other people and got sent to jail.
Why did he murder 2 other people?
They apparently got in a barroom brawl.
Okay. Now, how do you know this? Because here we have an article which says that Charles Marshall has been sentenced for the murder of these folks you just described. How do we know this, Mr. Dutton?
Well, one of the other things that Genevieve has done a great job of that we also collect are the original newspaper from that area, from
Right.
that time. And so she actually has those preserved at the archives as well.
And as I understand it, you have back issues of the San Bernardino Sun from inception to 1998, is that right?
Correct. So we have it before it was the Sun, when it was the Courier, and then it becomes the Sun. So from 1894 to 1998.
And so that's why you have this headline.
Yes.
Okay, it's getting complicated, but I think it's important and fun. And so we know that Mr. Marshall, who had the original claim,
Gave it to Frank James,
who gets killed.
who gets killed, and then Marshall gets sentenced to San Quentin for his murders.
Right.
But all of his defense was paid for by the McKinney gang.
Who would have thunk?
Yeah.
Who would have thunk? And so the McKinney gang,
Actually takes over the claim.
and
It's the Desert Queen Mine.
here's the Desert Queen Mine. And we know this again because Assessor Clerk Recorder has all these documents.
Yes.
And what about these pictures? How do you have these pictures?
The pictures are also in the collection. Various people have donated the pictures to us, and they're also in the Sun collection.
Perfect. Tell us about the Desert Queen Mine.
So the Desert Queen Mine was actually a very good mine. It yielded $30,000 to $40,000 per year. But the McKinneys squandered that very quickly. And according to another story, which isn't corroborated, they gave some money to Charlie Martin, who killed James, and they gave a group of cattle. What's it?
Right, a herd.
A herd of cattle, yeah.
Right.
So don't know
Right.
those names. To George Myers, whose gun was used in the murder.
Okay.
But then they kind of ran out of money, and Jim McKinney, one of the brothers, decided to go open a saloon in San Bernardino on D Street.
Tell us about D Street in San Bernardino of the era. Are you familiar with that?
No.
It's an area of...
It was an area of ill repute.
Okay,
It was
yeah.
saloons and
That's the reason I'm
other
not
things.
familiar with.
Exactly. How dare I ask? And he gets himself into trouble again.
He gets himself into trouble because Jim McKinney gets arrested for issuing counterfeit coins, spending around town, which he said he got by cashing a check in Redlands. But it comes out that actually he and his brother were counterfeiting gold coin up on their ranch outside of Cowcam.
And here's the headline.
Yes, and so he
And you have this in your archives.
Correct. And he actually wasn't very smart because he ordered all the electroplating chemicals that are required to counterfeit gold coin sent to his own post office box.
So we're hoping, Mr. Dutton, that we can legitimize this area. Are we close?
We're close.
We're close. And so what am I holding up now, Genevieve Preston?
That's a picture of Barker and Shea using the actual area for legitimate cattle purposes. So they started using it to winter their cattle there. and use the hidden valley because it's a natural spring and it was great for the cattle. And Barker and Shea are pretty much using the area until another gentleman comes into the area who is not quite as nefarious as the McCaneys, but just as infamous, let's say, by the end of his life.
His name?
His name is Bill Keyes, but he started out life as George Barth.
And he knew?
And he actually joined Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. That's when he changed his name.
Dutton, I don't even know where to go with this. Continue. We'll get you. We'll have her tell the story, then we'll talk to you more. Keep going.
Fine.
It's all good.
So he joins the Rough Riders, but he breaks his leg, so he doesn't end up going to Cuba. Then he ends up coming to settle in actually Death Valley, and he befriends Walter Scott, more known as Death Valley Scotty.
Here he is,
And
Death Valley Scotty.
Yeah, so Death Valley Scotty and Mr. Keyes get involved in the infamous Battle of Wingate Pass.
And what happens there?
So the Battle of Wingate Pass is, Scotty is trying to get investors in his non-existent mine, actually, and so an engineer says, well, I need to see it, so I'm going to come out and see the mine in Death Valley. Well, Scotty knows he doesn't have a mine, so he has to do an elaborate ruse. So part of it is there's going to be an ambush, there's going to be all these things. Unfortunately, during the fake ambush, his one brother, Scotty's brother, gets shot. Well, Scotty then responds by running at the people supposedly ambushing them, saying, stop, don't shoot, which then makes the engineer who's supposed to see the mine question the authenticity of this ambush.
And then what happens?
They get warrants for their arrest, and they get taken to San Bernardino County until Keyes and Scotty point out that they're out of their jurisdiction. So
And how would they know that? Because that's an issue of line drawing.
Well, again, we do surveying and things of that nature.
And that falls under your office, presumably.
Correct.
Okay, so keep going.
So they actually get it thrown out because the incident actually occurred in Inyo County, not San Bernardino County.
Okay.
But after it, Walter Keyes decides he's going to go down to the 29 Palms Morongo Basin. So he goes down there and he actually starts looking after the Desert Queen mine.
We're back at Desert Queen.
We're back at the Desert Queen. And so he actually starts a ranch and he calls it the Desert Queen Ranch. And he actually gets it because the gentleman who owned it at that point, not the McCaneys, dies and he hadn't paid him for 5 years. And so he files a suit and he gets the claim for the mine. And he also then homesteads another 160 acres, taking over the watering grounds and not letting Barker and Shea use it for their cattle.
But what happens with the McCaneys?
Well, Jim dies in prison, but William gets out and he goes back to live there, and Keyes takes care of him for the rest of his life. And he has little mines and various things, and he gives everything to Keyes at the end of his life for helping take care of him when he got out.
So McCane's back, Keyes is back, but oh no.
But Keyes doesn't stay on the right side of the law either, because he had an issue with his neighbor, Worth Bagley, who was actually a retired LA deputy sheriff.
This is worth, no, this is not Worth Bagley?
No, this is Worth Bagley. That's actually his picture dead.
Dead.
With his gun. So what happens is Keyes kills Bagley over an issue. It's an ambush, he says.
Right.
He goes to turn himself into the local sheriff. They call San Bernardino to come get him. The person who happens to come get him is Will Shea, as in Barker and Shea, the cattlemen that he had not allowed to use the watering hole. So they take him to San Bernardino to await trial, but then they find out that it didn't happen in San Bernardino County. Keyes was in San Bernardino County, but Bagley was in Riverside County. So since Bagley was shot dead, they have to then transfer him to Riverside County.
And that's what we'll talk about when we come back. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're telling a tall tale, but it's true, of a series of cattle ranchers, gold miners that got involved in a series of crimes and murders. And I want to ask you, Mr. Dutton, clerk, assessor, recorder, What do you make of the fact that your archivist is able to figure all this out with the documents?
Well, I think actually, the people that serve in those capacities, not just in San Bernardino County,
Right.
but the state and so forth, they're actually very good at just dealing with the
Right.
facts. Okay, and because they don't have political agendas,
Of course,
or
right?
anything
Well
of that
stated.
nature.
Well stated.
And so they're just basically looking for the facts, and I think that's what makes them extremely
Right.
valuable to everybody.
Right, and the fact is that when Mr. Bagley got out of jail for having killed,
No, Keys gets out.
when Mr. Keys gets out of jail for killing Mr. Bagley, he puts up this.
He puts up that memorial to just say what happened. Here is where I shot Worth Bagley. He bit the dust, because he did actually get sent to San Quentin, but he was actually paroled after 5 years because of the effort of some very famous people, because his trial was considered a mockery of justice, because Bagley, it came out eventually, they found Bagley's wife, that he was barricading Keys Road, he was stealing his cattle, he was doing all these things. And the person who actually helped him was Earl Stanley Gardner,
Who
as
is?
in the writer of Perry Mason novels.
Wow.
But the reason why he did that too is because he got pardoned, right?
He did get pardoned. He officially got pardoned because they found Bagley's wife to corroborate all the evidence that the previous judge had thrown out.
And that's when he put up the money.
Right.
And then he puts it up.
And while all this is happening, 29 Palms is developing through legitimate migration, I guess you could say. And this is an example of veterans moving into the 29 Palms area.
Yes, so the whole Morongo Basin was considered very good because of the dry heat for people suffering from mustard gas,
Right.
various things that happened during World War I. It was very good for them. And actually there was an act that changed the Homestead Act. It was in 1938, you no longer had to homestead 160 acres. You could do what they called jackrabbit, so it's 5 acres and under, so it was much more manageable for most people.
Right. And we started seeing kind of Hollywood influence seep in.
Hollywood influence. So at the same time you're having this Wild West shootout, Hollywood starts to use the same area for all their movies and westerns. So Dick Curtis comes into the area.
Right, right.
And actually, he's a notorious Hollywood villain, not McCaney brother villain, a
Right.
fake villain.
Right, right.
You know, and he recommends to his friends Gean Autry and Roy Rogers, and they form a corporation, the Pioneer Town Corporation, and they build this town, which they then also use as their movie sets. So they actually use it as their movie sets.
And at this time, around this time, we see Joshua Tree National Monument grow up. Mr. Dutton, give us a sense of what Joshua Tree is today, and then we'll go back to Genevieve.
Well, Joshua Tree is one of the areas that is attractive to people who
Right.
like a desert type living. It's very much military oriented.
Right.
We have a lot of retired military in those areas.
And starting back from 1930.
Absolutely.
Past
going way
informs the
back.
present.
And the 29 Palms base is still in
Right.
operation today. It's actually a lot more activity today than it was.
Right,
than
right,
it
I
has
knew that.
been in the past.
Right.
So it's a growing area.
And this area became a national monument back in 1936, is that right?
1936.
And this is a depiction of it from that time.
From that time, yeah.
And so give us a sense of how the Assessor-Clerk-Recorder's office is still dealing with issues dating back from pre-1936 as the National Monument has continued to develop.
Well, because it was created so late or in the 20th century, there are still mining claims that exist on it. There's still railroad lands. There's private holdings that actually exist in the park. And the park still comes and does research on those mining claims to make sure they're following all the rules and regulations that they have
What do you
to.
think of that? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy to think that we're what, 80 years out, and from this declaration of national monument status, and your office is still having to help out to make sure that that area is
San
open.
Bernardino County is rich in mineral deposits,
Right.
and there's gold, silver. There's still a lot of mines that are out there today. The only challenge they have is that the cost of getting to the precious minerals or metals
Right.
so is such that it doesn't make it practical. However, those times are changing.
Right.
As time marches on, then they become technologies, there
Right,
new
right.
techniques on how to extract gold and silver, and you know, it's just a timing issue. But people are protecting those mineral
Right.
rights, and of course
Right.
we keep all those records.
So what do these incidents say to you? How do they speak to you, Mr. Dutton, Ms. Preston?
Well, it tells me the history of an area. When I first got elected to the Senate, I didn't even realize that I was representing Pioneer Town.
Oh, that's
Okay,
great.
so
Pioneer Town, right, right.
There was a fire, and I
Right.
thought it was somebody else's
Right,
district,
right.
and so I found out that it was my district.
Right.
And it's really interesting how these things can get started. Like you said, this was a movie set that then went on to become a town, and it's an active town today. What I really like what's happening in our high desert region is that there's a respect for the natural environment that's there, to try to protect that while we actually are going in and starting to allow development and things to take place. There's also water deposits, things like this that will enable people to be able to live out in those areas.
So there was a water tower built.
Yeah.
Back in the early part of the 20th century. They called it City Hall as a joke.
As a joke, they put up a city hall of 29 palms.
And there were ceremonies held.
They actually got a justice of the peace and did some ceremonies at their city
Right.
hall.
And because 29 Palms is part of kind of, I don't want to say the hinterlands, but it's a little farther out than San Bernardino County, your office wants to serve the needs of 29 Palms, and you recently opened.
Well, we had an assessor's office out in the area, out in Joshua Tree, and so what we just recently did is we decided to expand recorder-clerk services to the area, so that people wouldn't have to necessarily travel all the way into San Bernardino, city of San Bernardino, in order to get married or different services of the recorder-clerk's office.
So what does this these series of events say to you? How do they speak to you?
Well, I just love that you have this romanticized view of the Wild West, but it's still going on in the 1940s, and it's still going on today, and there's still people out there who live that Wild West.
I think a lot of times people don't understand that when they think about the West, they think about the 1800s and things of that, but that's actually here in San Bernardino County and in other areas of the state and the country, it continued on well into the 1940s. We're heading into World War II, we're hitting, or World War I and going into World War II, and things. There's a lot of things that were still going on that very much part of the old Wild West.
And I think it really does inform how we look at the county of San Bernardino. I mean, there is, even to this day, and I don't mean to be pejorative, there's kind of a Wild West mentality in San Bernardino County, unlike Riverside County, which considers itself quite patrician. San Bernardino County, again.
Well, the thing to remember about when you take a look at some of these early beginnings, just like the early tribe that started, inhabited the area, the Serranos, and the 29 Palms that were put there, and now you got town 29 Palms. I don't think those, I think there's significance there. I think that is probably directly related to how the town probably it had its name. But when you take a look at the way that the lifestyle and the things and how they lived back in those days, they had to be pretty well self-sufficient. It wasn't like you had a police officer or a fireman around every corner.
We're going to have you back. He is Bob Dutton. She is Genevieve Preston. We are so glad you stayed with us on this edition of Local Edition.